The storm had been building for 3 days before it finally broke. By the time the snow reached the height of the sandbag walls surrounding Forward Medical Station Keller, visibility had dropped to 40 meters, and the trees at the edge of the marsh had vanished entirely behind a white curtain so thick it seemed solid. The generators coughed. The heating elements in the medical tents struggled against temperatures that had fallen 17 degrees in 6 hours. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the tree line, somewhere in that pale, suffocating silence, something was watching. No one noticed the new nurse arrive. She appeared between 2 shifts, when the exhausted staff were too focused on the incoming frostbite casualties to pay attention to paperwork. Medium height, lean in a way that suggested discipline rather than deprivation. Dark hair pulled back without ceremony. She wore standard-issue scrubs and moved through the intake tent with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that drawing attention was a liability, not an asset. Her name on the assignment sheet read, Clara Weston, RN, temporary placement. Dr. Harrison Boley looked at the sheet, looked at her, and went back to his sutures without a word. She found her station. She reviewed the patient charts. She administered medications on schedule. And while she worked, her pale gray eyes moved slow, methodical, unhurried across every window, every entrance, every shadow pooled in the corners of the tent. No one noticed. But she noticed everything. Forward Medical Station Keller sat at the edge of the Halverson Marshes in northern Manitoba, a temporary installation of 6 interconnected canvas tents anchored to a frozen bog that had no business hosting a medical facility. The location had been chosen for strategic reasons that had nothing to do with comfort or safety. It was the only flat ground within 12 kilometers. It was equidistant from 3 active operational zones, and it was theoretically inaccessible to vehicle-borne threats given the surrounding terrain. Theoretically, the installation had been operational for 11 weeks. In that time, it had processed 462 patients, lost 9 of them, and burned through 2 generators, 1 satellite uplink, and the patients of every physician and nurse assigned there. The staff rotated on 3-week cycles. The equipment did not improve between cycles. The marsh did not care. Dr. Harrison Bowl was in his 2nd week of his 3rd rotation and had long since stopped pretending the conditions were acceptable. He was 41, broad-shouldered, red-faced from cold and fatigue, with hands that moved with the automatic precision of someone who had performed the same procedures so many times, they no longer required conscious thought. He was not a cruel man. He was simply a man who had learned to conserve everything, warmth, words, patience, because none of it was available in surplus. Weston, he said on her 2nd morning, not looking up from the wound he was irrigating, pre-op on the Hansen case. Already done, she said. He looked up then. Patients did not get pre-op completed before he asked. That was not the rhythm of this place. Labs? Pending. I flagged them as urgent with the lab tent 20 minutes ago. Results in approximately 40 minutes. Bull said nothing. He went back to his irrigation, but something in the back of his mind, some small, quiet mechanism that had nothing to do with medicine, filed that interaction away. On her 3rd day complete, the other nurses learned what kind of person Clara Weston was. Nurse Delia Marsh, who had been at Keller for 6 weeks and had accumulated the informal authority that comes with tenure in miserable places, asked her to restock the supply tent. "I'll do it after I finish the vitals check on the burn patients," Clara said. "I'm asking you to do it now." Clara looked at her. Not with hostility, with the flat, measured attention of someone calculating distance and wind. "The burn patients in Bay 3 haven't had their 8 o'clock check. If I do the supply tent first, I'll miss the window. I'll restock as soon as I'm done." She turned and walked toward Bay 3. Delia Marsh watched her go with the specific expression of someone who has just realized they are not, in fact, the most competent person in the room, and finds this deeply annoying. By her 4th day, Clara had mapped the entire installation. She had done this without appearing to do it. It happened in the margins of her actual work, a pause at a tent junction while adjusting her gloves, a moment at the perimeter sandbags while emptying biohazard containers, a slow walk between the generator housing and the supply tent with a clipboard she didn't need to consult. She noted the sight lines, the angles, The dead ground the areas that couldn't be observed from any fixed position. The marsh to the northeast was the problem. The frozen cattails and black spruce grew in irregular clusters that would provide excellent concealment for anyone willing to endure the cold. The trees were 280 meters from the nearest tent, 410 meters from the far generator housing. The ground between was a mix of frozen mud and ice-crusted snow that would support weight in some places and swallow a man to his knees in others. She knew this because she had walked it herself on her first morning, before the rest of the staff were awake. She told no one what she found there. But on her fourth evening, she moved her personal kit to the tent closest to the northeast wall. Delia Marsh noticed and said nothing. Dr. Cole noticed and said nothing. The young medic, Private Christopher Dell, who had been at Keller for only 9 days, noticed and asked, "Why'd you move your stuff over here?" Clara looked at him. He was 23, earnest, with a kind of open face that hadn't yet learned to conceal what it was thinking. "Better insulation in this tent," she said. Christopher Dell looked at the tent walls, which were visibly identical to every other tent in the installation. He nodded slowly. She was already looking at the marsh. On the night of the 5th day, the temperature dropped to -28. The snow had been falling for 36 hours and showed no intention of stopping. The camp's external lighting, a line of floodlights mounted on poles along the perimeter, created a diffuse, milky glow that turned the falling snow into something beautiful and useless. Visibility beyond the perimeter wire was 0. Clara was on the midnight shift. She worked through it methodically. Rounds, medications, charts, rounds again. At 2 in the morning, she stepped outside the intake tent to dispose of sharps and stood for a moment in the cold. She was not looking at the snow. She was listening to it. The marsh, in a true blizzard, was not silent. It groaned and cracked as the ice shifted. Branches broke under accumulating weight, with sounds like distant rifle shots. Wind moved through the frozen cattails with a thin, high whistle that changed pitch as its direction changed. She knew these sounds. At 2:17 a.m., one of them changed. Not loudly, not dramatically. A slight, almost imperceptible variation in the wind sound from the northeast. A disturbance in a pattern that had been consistent for hours. Clara stood very still for 4 seconds. Then she went back inside. She did not run. She did not raise an alarm. She moved to the central communications station, where a board corporal named Williams was monitoring radios he hadn't heard anything useful on in 3 days. She stood beside him without speaking for a moment, and read the duty roster pinned to the board above his station. 4 guards on the perimeter, 2 on the north and east sides, 2 on the south and west. Standard rotation. "When's the next check-in from the northeast post?" she asked. Williams checked his log. 10 minutes. "If they miss it," she said, "wake Dr. Bowley immediately." Williams looked at her. "They won't miss it." Clara said nothing. She went back to rounds. At 2:29 a.m., the northeast post missed its check-in. Williams reached for the radio. Clara was already standing in the doorway of the communications tent, and the expression on her face, or rather the complete absence of any expression at all, made Williams's hand freeze for just a moment before he keyed the mic. The first shot came at 2:31 a.m. It didn't sound like a gunshot. Not indoors, not through canvas and insulation and the white noise of the blizzard. It sounded like someone had dropped a heavy piece of equipment in the patient bay, a single sharp crack, followed by silence, followed by a sound that wasn't quite a scream. Clara was in motion before the echo finished. She moved through the intake tent at a pace that was fast but not running, which was the pace of someone who understood that running in a medical tent full of equipment and sleeping patients was how people died. She reached the supply bay, opened a specific locker, the one she had spent 40 seconds inspecting on her second day, and removed a medical kit with her left hand. With her right hand, she found the emergency lighting box and snapped it open. She looked at the main light control panel for exactly 1 second. Then she walked to the central junction, the hub, connecting all 6 tents, and stood in the open where she could see into every corridor simultaneously. Dr. Cole. Her voice was not loud. It cut through the noise the way a cold front cuts through warm air, not by force but by displacement. "Get your patients to the floor, northwest corner of each bay. Now." Bowley emerged from Bay 2. He was wearing a surgical mask and holding bloody gloves at chest height, and his face had the look of a man whose mental model of the current situation was several seconds behind reality. "What the?" "Patient down in Bay 4, Clara said. "Gunshot wound, likely neck or upper chest based on the sound. That patient is secondary. Right now, I need every conscious patient moved to the northwest corners and every light in this installation turned off in the next 60 seconds. You can't turn off the lights. We have critical. They're using our lights to range." She said it with no inflection whatsoever, not an argument, a fact being communicated. "They take the next shot," and she glanced at the canvas wall to the northeast, calculating 30 seconds. "If the lights are on when they do, someone dies. If they're off, we lose the range anchor and they have to recalibrate. That buys us 4 to 7 minutes. Bulla stared at her. Christopher Dell, who had appeared in the junction from Bay 3, stared at her. Delia Marsh, emerging from the medication station, stared at her. 20 seconds, Clara said. Something in Dr. Harrison Bull's brain, the part that had been trained to recognize competence under pressure, the part that had been doing this for 15 years and knew what composed authority looked like, processed the information and issued a verdict. "Cut the main power," he said to Dell. "Do it." Dell ran. The lights died at the 30-second mark. 4 seconds later, the second shot came. It punched through the canvas of Bay 4, 3 feet above the now empty cots, where 2 patients had been lying. The shot was high. The shooter had recalibrated upward, adjusting for where the heads would have been if people were still in the beds. In the darkness, someone gasped. Clara's voice came from a different location than where she'd been standing. "They know we moved. Standard adjustment time for a cold shooter in these conditions is approximately 90 seconds. Use it." A pause. "Dr. Bull, I need your guard, staff, whoever's left assembled at the central junction. I need your most mobile patients moved to the supply tent, which is the lowest profile structure in the installation. I need anyone with combat experience identified immediately." A flashlight beam found her face. She didn't blink. "Who are you?" Bull asked. "Right now, the person running your defense." She took the flashlight from his hand and turned it off. "Save the batteries. We'll need them later." The next 7 minutes were controlled chaos, with Clara as the controlling element. She moved through the installation in the dark with a certainty that should have been impossible. She directed staff and mobile patients to positions using a mental map she had assembled over 5 days of apparently routine nursing work. She commandeered the 2 remaining guard personnel, both young, both frightened, both steady enough once they had someone telling them what to do, and positioned them at the southern approaches with instructions that were specific to the point of being almost ceremonial in their precision. "You are not here to engage," she told them. "You are here to observe and report. You see movement in your sector, you do not shoot. You find me, and you tell me. Do you understand?" They nodded. "Say it." "Observe and report," said the first guard, a young man named Private Terrence Fuller. "Observe and report," said the second, a woman named Corporal Annette Shaw. "Good." Clara turned to go. "Ma'am," said Fuller. He was 22 and trying very hard to be professional about the fact that he was terrified. "How many of them are out there?" Clara paused. "At least 6, probably 8, moving in 2 elements, eastern approach and northeast approach, which suggests they know our layout and intend to converge. The eastern element will reach the wire in approximately 9 minutes. The northeast element is already through the wire." Fuller's face did something complicated. "That's why we're not engaging," Clara said. "We engage with 2 personnel and we lose 2 personnel. We buy time instead. 9 minutes is enough." Enough for what? She was already gone. In the central junction, by the thin gray light bleeding through the canvas from the snow outside, Dr. Bull found himself in conversation with a man he hadn't expected to see vertical. Master Sergeant Raymond Cord, retired, 54. Currently, a patient recovering from a shrapnel injury to his left thigh had dressed himself in the dark and was standing in the junction with the careful weight distribution of someone whose left leg was unreliable, but who wasn't going to acknowledge this in present company. "That woman," he said to Bull, without preamble. "Where did she come from?" "Assignment sheet says." "Assignment sheet says whatever it says. I'm asking where she came from." Cord's voice was low and very controlled. The way she moved in the dark just now, The way she positioned those two kids. That's not nursing school. Bo looked at him. Her wrists, Cord said. Did you see her wrists? Bole had not. Cord pulled a small flashlight from his cargo pocket because, of course, he had a flashlight, because men like Raymond Cord always had flashlights, and swept it briefly over his own forearm. He was indicating something, but the light was off before Bole could see what. There's a unit, Cord said. Special Operations, Tier 1, if you know what that means. They run sniper teams in Arctic and subarctic conditions. Independent operations, usually, very small cells. They have a marking. He paused. I've only ever met one person who had it. She died 6 years ago. Bole said nothing for a long moment. Or, Cord said, she didn't. Clara had established a command structure in 11 minutes. She had done it without announcing that she was doing it, which was the only way command structures got established in situations like this one. She simply made decisions, and the decisions were correct, and so people followed them, which meant she was in command. The logic was circular, and it was also the only logic that mattered when people were shooting at you. The installation's 6 tents had become 4 functional zones. Zone 1, the supply tent and generator housing, lowest profile, now containing non-mobile patients, critical equipment, and 2 nurses whose job was to keep people alive in the dark without making noise. Zone 2, the 2 patient bays that had been emptied, now serving as a controlled decoy, the cots left in place, the emergency lighting on low timers that would create the impression of occupancy at intervals. Zone 3, the central junction and communications tent, where Bole and Cord were coordinating, where Williams was working the radio with religious intensity, where the slim hope of outside contact lived. Zone 4, everywhere else, dark, mobile, where Clara operated. She had found the second element before they found her. They came through the northeast wire at the point she had identified as the most vulnerable, crossing a low section of the perimeter barrier where the ground ice had heaved, creating a gap. She watched them come from a position in the cattails 12 meters inside the perimeter, lying flat in snow that was up to her chin. 4 of them, moving in a staggered file, professional interval spacing, night vision equipment on 3 of them, and the 4th, the one at the rear, moving with a particular kind of deliberateness that told her he was the element's designated marksman. Clara watched them pass within 15 meters of her position. She counted their equipment. She noted their communications posture, radio check frequency, hand signal language. She memorized the route they took through the installation approach, which was not the direct route and therefore indicated prior knowledge of the camp layout. Prior knowledge. She filed that fact in the specific mental folder where she kept things that were going to matter later. She let them pass. Then she moved to the communications tent. I need a rifle, she said to Master Sergeant Cord. The old man looked at her for a moment, with the particular expression of someone who has suspected something for a while and is now watching it be confirmed. He reached under the triage table and produced a scoped bolt-action rifle where it had come from, how it had arrived in a medical facility, were questions nobody in the tent chose to ask, and held it out to her. Clara took it. She checked the action. She checked the scope. She worked the bolt and felt the mechanism and knew, from the weight and resistance and the quality of the click, what she was dealing with. Ammunition, she said. Cord produced a half box. 12 rounds, she said. 12 rounds, he confirmed. Clara turned the rifle over in her hands once. Then she looked up. There are 2 elements. 8 personnel total, give or take. The eastern element will be at the wire in 4 minutes. The northeast element is already on site and moving toward the decoy bays. She looked at Bole. When they hit the decoys, when they realize the beds are empty, they'll have approximately 90 seconds of confusion and reorganization. That is when the eastern element will arrive, because their timeline is coordinated with a radio signal that the northeast element has not yet sent. How do you know that? Bole asked. Because I watched them do their radio check when they came through the wire, and they used a standard confirmation protocol. The call will come when they've confirmed patient contact. She looked at the tent entrance. They will not confirm patient contact, so they won't call. So the eastern element waits. She looked at Cord. How long does a professional element wait before assuming something has gone wrong and adjusting protocol? Cord thought about this. 8 to 10 minutes. 7 to 9 in Arctic conditions, Clara said. Cold creates urgency. She turned toward the exit. "I need 9 minutes. Can you keep the radio contact open long enough for extraction to scramble?" Williams looked up from his station. "If I can get a clean signal through this weather, maybe." "Try." She paused at the tent flap. "The decoy lighting in Bay 1 will cycle in approximately 3 minutes. That's when they breach the bay. That's when you'll know the northeast element is committed." She stepped out into the snow. The men in the eastern tree line had been waiting in temperatures no sane operational planner would have ordered human beings to wait in. They had been there for 4 hours. Their commander, a man who went by the operational designation Crane, who had 12 years of contract work behind him, and who had stopped being troubled by the moral dimensions of his employment roughly around year 4, was lying in a snow trench he dug with methodical patience, while his element positioned itself along the target's eastern approach. Crane was 51 years old and had the specific, weathered quality of machinery that has been maintained under adverse conditions for a long time. Not worn out, maintained. There was a difference, and the difference was professionalism. He checked his watch. The northeast element had gone in 20 minutes ago. They should have confirmed patient contact by now. They had not. Crane worked through the possibilities with the flat affect of a man who had learned that panic was an operational liability and had therefore engineered it out of his responses through repetition and will. Possibility 1. The northeast element had encountered technical difficulties. Equipment failure in extreme cold was common. Possible. Possibility 2. The northeast element had encountered unexpected resistance. The facility was supposed to be lightly defended, but suppose it wasn't. Possible. Possibility 3. The northeast element had encountered her. Crane stared at the medical facility's perimeter lights still on, still marking the installation like a beacon, and revised his assessment of possibility 3 from unlikely to probable. He had been told she was dead. He had read the after-action report himself. 6 years ago, in a situation not dissimilar to this one white ground, black trees, a target that moved like something that had been taught to disappear, she had gone into the mountain and not come out. The conclusion drawn by the unit was unambiguous. No body, but no survivor either. Crane had written one line in his private assessment at the time: "I would want to see the body." Nobody had retrieved the body. He had said nothing. He had taken the contract and done the work and not asked questions, because that was what his professional life was built on. But he had never quite believed it. "Element lead, status check," he said into his radio. Silence. He waited 30 seconds. "Element lead, silence." Crane lowered the radio. He looked at the installation. Then, he looked at the trees along the northern approach, the angle between the northeast element's last known position and the installation's perimeter. Something moved. It was barely visible. A change in texture between one moment and the next, the way a shadow shifts when the light source moves. Except the light wasn't moving. He stared at the spot. It was gone. He looked away. He looked back. Nothing. But the thing about her, the thing that had made her what she was, the reason she had a name that people said in certain circles with a specific kind of quietness, was that by the time you saw her, the information was no longer useful. "Fall back to secondary," he said. His element began to move. Clara was lying in the snow 30 meters inside the tree line when she heard the command. She couldn't make out the words. The wind and the distance took the consonants and left her with rhythm and tone, but the rhythm of a commander adjusting his element's position had a quality she had learned to read. Way other people read faces. The acceleration of movement, the sudden loss of interval spacing as personnel collapsed toward a tighter formation, the specific silence of a group that has become uncertain of its own perimeter. They were pulling back. She moved before the decision had fully formed in her conscious mind. Her body acted on 6 years of dormancy that had not, it turned out, been erasure. She came out of the tree line into the open ground between the forest and the installation's eastern approach, moving at a low diagonal that kept her silhouette against the tree line's dark edge rather than the open snow. The wind was from the east-northeast. The temperature was -26 and falling. The snow was medium density enough to scatter light without being enough to distort a bullet path significantly at ranges under 500 meters. She had no night vision equipment. She didn't need it. She found a position behind a collapsed section of perimeter sandbags, not the wall itself, which was an obvious firing position, but a cluster of frozen drainage pipes 6 meters in front of it, which was not. She settled into the snow. She found her breathing. She let it slow. The eastern element was at the wire. She could see them, or rather, she could see the difference between the darkness of the forest and the darkness of human-shaped objects moving against it. 4 personnel, now tighter together than ideal, moving toward a secondary position that would be approximately 40 meters to the southwest of their original location. Clara watched the one at the rear. He was moving differently from the others. Not worse, differently. He moved with the specific economy of someone accustomed to carrying a scoped rifle as a primary weapon, which meant he also thought in ranges and angles and sight lines. He was scanning while he moved, which meant he was good, which meant he was the most dangerous person in the element. She put the crosshairs on him. Wind, east-northeast, 12 to 14 kilometers per hour. Gusting. Range. She estimated 420 meters by triangulation from the tree positions she had memorized. Temperature effect on powder charge. Calculable. She did the calculation in the same part of her brain that other people used for remembering grocery lists. It took less than 2 seconds. She breathed out. She heard a voice behind her, Christopher Dell, who had come up without her noticing, which surprised her slightly because she did not usually fail to notice, saying in a shaky whisper, "What's the wind speed?" She had already squeezed the trigger. The shot crossed 420 meters in approximately half a second. The element's marksman dropped. The remaining 3 personnel scattered. She heard the controlled panic of professionals who have just realized their sniper designation has been neutralized and who are reprocessing the tactical situation from scratch. Clara moved before they finished reprocessing. Behind her, Christopher Dell stood in the snow with his mouth open and his hands hanging at his sides, and the white flakes fell around him, and the darkness was very large, and the shot was still echoing off the frozen trees. In the central communications tent, Master Sergeant Raymond Cord heard the shot. He heard the quality of it, the weight and the distance, and he recognized both. He sat down on an overturned supply crate and put his hands on his knees and looked at nothing for a long moment. He said one word, very quietly, to no one in particular. The word was a name, not Clara Weston. The other one. The one that had been declared dead 6 years ago. Phantom Snow. She did not move in straight lines. The installation was her terrain now. She had mapped it, owned it, turned its apparent vulnerabilities into assets and its apparent strengths into liabilities. She moved from the sandbag cluster to a derelict supply vehicle buried to its axles in snow near the eastern approach, and from there to the space between 2 tent walls where a gap in the canvas created a shadow that the external lighting couldn't reach, and from there to a depression in the frozen ground that the natural drainage of the site had carved over 11 weeks of seasonal melt and refreeze. She was not running. She was not hiding. She was positioning. The northeast element had broken from the decoy bays she had heard the moment it happened. A sharp burst of movement and a single muffled exchange of words that carried through the canvas. They were in the open now, between the bays and the supply tent, moving in the uncertain way of people who have encountered a situation that diverges from their briefing. She came around the northern end of the communications tent at low crawl speed and rose to a knee at a position that put a 3-meter supply stack between herself and the northeast element's last known location. 2 of the 4 were visible, moving parallel, looking for targets. She was already part of the shadows. The 3rd came around the supply tent's rear corner and nearly walked into her. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds and made no significant noise and left the 3rd man unconscious in the snow with a clinical efficiency that was, if anything, more unnerving than gunfire would have been. The 4th had separated from the group. She had anticipated this, because it was what she would have done, and was repositioning toward the generator housing. She moved to intercept. Private Christopher Dell appeared from somewhere he shouldn't have been, holding a fire extinguisher and trying to look useful. She gestured sharply down, now, and he went flat in the snow with admirable speed. She moved past him. The 4th man from the northeast element met the same dark efficiency as the 3rd. He was professional enough to almost anticipate the threat. Almost. One of the two visible personnel had turned and was scanning in her direction, not because he'd seen her, but because he was good enough to know that the silence around him was wrong. She had seen this before. The moment when a well-trained operative registers an absence where a presence should be and tries to turn the absence into information. "Drop the weapon." His voice was low and controlled. He was speaking into the darkness, which meant he didn't know where she was. She said nothing. He waited. His partner was moving to the right, trying to flank the darkness. Standard response. Correct response. Still, she said nothing. The wind picked up. Snow came sideways through the narrow corridor between tents. The generator housing made its constant machine sound. Then Christopher Dell, from his position flat in the snow approximately 8 meters to the operator's left, said, "I think she's behind you." It was not a great piece of tactical advice, but it worked. The man turned fractionally, just enough, and Clara stepped out of the shadow 2 meters to his right and resolved the situation with a speed and precision that left Dell staring at the fallen figure with an expression of pure astonishment. "Stop helping," she said to Dell. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She was already moving. Her real name was not Clara Weston. It had been Clara Weston for 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days since the afternoon in a government office in Winnipeg, when a woman with no identifying features had handed her a manila envelope and told her that the paperwork inside represented a complete and verifiable identity, that no questions had been asked or answered, and that certain parties considered the matter closed. Clara Weston had been a nursing student before she disappeared in an unrelated accident 3 years prior. The identity was solid. It had withstood 2 background checks. It would probably withstand a third. Her actual name was Victoria Strand. She had been born in Duluth, Minnesota, in a house near the waterfront, to a father who'd taught high school history and a mother who'd worked in maritime logistics. She had been, by every available metric, an ordinary person until she was 19, when the testing suggested otherwise. The testing was a series of evaluations administered by a branch of the military whose full name she had never been officially told, and the results had placed her in a cohort of 7 people who were invited into a program that did not appear on any publicly available record. The program ran for 3 years. Of the 7 people who entered it, 5 completed it. Of those 5, 3 were eventually deployed in operational capacities. Victoria Strand had the highest performance record in the program's history. The unit was designated Ghost Sniper Unit, a designation that had never been officially acknowledged, and its operational name chosen by the unit's members, not its commanders, was Phantom Snow, Cold Environments, Long Range, Independent Operation. The betrayal had come on the 14th month. It came in the form of a man named Thomas Crane, operational designation, same as the Crane who was currently reorganizing his element in the tree line beyond the installation who had, it emerged later, been passing unit positioning data to a third party for reasons that had never been fully explained, though the financial dimension seemed most likely. The mission on which it happened was a winter operation in the Yukon Highlands. She had been in position for 18 hours, target confirmed, waiting for the extraction window that was supposed to open at 0300. The extraction had not come. Instead, at 0247, she had heard the sound of multiple approaching personnel from the direction of her extraction route and understood, with a clarity that had no emotional content at all, what was happening. She had gone into the mountain. She had stayed there for 11 days. When she came out alone, frost damaged, 11 pounds lighter, with a left hand that would never quite close all the way again, she had presented herself at a civilian hospital in Whitehorse under a name she invented on the spot. She had spent 3 weeks there. She had then walked out. It had taken her 8 months to construct the identity. Another 4 months to complete the nursing qualifications she'd already had most of the groundwork for. Another 6 months to find work that was remote enough, critical enough, and sufficiently revolving door in its staffing that a new face would draw no scrutiny. She had not touched a rifle in 6 years. She had not wanted to touch one. But the man in the tree line had her name in his files, the real one, not the invented one, and she had known this the moment she saw the way his element moved, because she had trained with elements that moved that way, and there was only one source from which that movement could have originated. She had not killed Thomas Crane 6 years ago because she had chosen not to. She had made a different choice. She was making different choices now. The attack on the installation's southern perimeter came at 3:44 a.m. It came from an angle she hadn't fully anticipated, not the direct southern approach, which she had covered, but a diagonal from the southwest that threaded between the supply tent and the generator housing, using the noise of the generator as acoustic cover. It was, she acknowledged to herself, a good tactical choice. Whoever had revised the plan after her initial disruption had correctly identified the generator noise as a mask, and correctly identified the southwest diagonal as the least covered approach. The revision had Crane's authorship. She recognized his work. The breach point was a seam in the installation's perimeter, a place where two different sections of temporary fencing had been joined with zip ties rather than welded. It was not a secret weakness. It was simply a weakness. 3 personnel came through it in 15 seconds, moving with the compressed urgency of people working against a clock. They made it 12 meters before the first one walked into the wire she had laid. Not a booby trap. She had nothing to make a booby trap from. She had taken a reel of medical suture wire from the supply tent, the strongest gauge available, and strung it ankle height between 2 drainage posts at a location that any competent person would not expect to find wire. The sound of someone going down hard on frozen ground carries. Clara moved from her position near the communications tent in a direction that was perpendicular to the threat, which was not the direction anyone would expect response to come from. She came around the eastern end of the supply tent and found the 2nd and 3rd personnel of the southwestern element, trying to locate their fallen teammate and simultaneously reorient to the installation layout. In the tent to her left, she heard the sound of a patient in pain. Someone in Bay 3, a man with a chest wound who had been managing, had been disturbed by the breach noise and was moving in a way he shouldn't. She registered this. She made a calculation. She dispatched the 3rd personnel with the efficiency that was becoming the operational signature of the night. And then, rather than pursuing the 2nd, who had now created distance, she went into Bay 3. Dr. Bowl was already there. He had come through the tent's internal junction, moving toward the sound of his patient, and he looked up when Clara entered, and the look on his face in the dim emergency lighting was the look of a man who was revising every assumption he had made about the world in the past week. "He moved wrong," she said, going to the patient's side, her hands already at the man's chest to check the wound seal. "Keep him still." "I'm the doctor here," Bowley said, not defensively. "As information." "You're the doctor here," she agreed. "I'm telling you what I know, and then getting out of your way." She checked the seal, found it intact, repositioned the man's arm in a way that reduced the pressure on his intercostal muscles, and was at the tent exit in 4 seconds. "He'll stop moving if you brace his left arm," she said on her way out. "He's been favoring it." Bowley looked at the patient's left arm. He looked at the exit through which Clara had vanished. He braced the arm. The patient settled. Outside, the sounds of the installation were shifting, the particular shift that comes when a tactical situation is reaching resolution rather than escalation. Fewer movements, longer silences between sounds. She was almost done, but not quite. He came for her himself. She had expected this. Not with certainty, she had assigned it a 65% probability when she began laying the night's groundwork, but with enough confidence that she had chosen her final position based on where the terrain would be most favorable for a confrontation between 2 people who both understood the geometry of long-range engagement. The position was the collapsed observation post at the installation's northern edge. It was technically outside the perimeter. It was a structure that had been decommissioned 3 weeks ago when one of its support legs had sunk into the frost-softened ground, and it now leaned at an 11-degree angle toward the northwest. Nobody used it. Nobody guarded it. It had an unobstructed 360-degree sightline. She was there before him. Thomas Crane came through the northern wire at 4:19 a.m., alone, which told her everything she needed to know about his current assessment of the situation. He was not bringing personnel because the personnel were no longer a viable asset. He was coming himself because he had correctly determined that this was the only viable option remaining, and he was doing it alone because he needed no witnesses. He moved beautifully. She would give him that. 11 years had not cost him anything. He came toward the observation post. She watched him come. The snow was falling harder now, the final intensification of the blizzard before the dawn. Weather patterns broke it apart. Visibility had dropped to perhaps 20 meters in open ground. The world beyond that distance was nothing but white noise and white void. They were 23 meters apart when he stopped. He knew she was there. She knew he knew. The observation post was dark. She was inside its leaning structure, positioned in the gap between two support beams, and she had been still for 11 minutes, which was long enough that her body temperature had equalized with the ambient air around her, and her shape, to any detection equipment operating on thermal variance, would register as nothing. He was scanning with a thermal monocular. She watched the device's infrared emitter, invisible to the naked eye, not invisible to her, sweep across the observation post structure. She did not move. She had been cold for 11 minutes, and the cold was deep now, the kind that reaches into muscle and slows the fine motor processes, and she acknowledged this as a factor and adjusted her grip accordingly. He stopped scanning. He knew something was wrong with the read. He was smart enough to know that a zero thermal return from a structure that should have contained some residual warmth was not a null result. It was a specific result that meant something. He raised his rifle. She heard, in the fraction of a second before everything moved, his breathing pattern shift. She knew that shift. She had cataloged it years ago in a different context. The brief suspended half-breath of a shooter who has resolved his aim and begun the final firing sequence. She was faster by 0.3 of a second. The margin came from a specific difference between them that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the structure of the moment. Thomas Crane believed on some level that she might hesitate, might carry some residual reluctance. 6 years of civilian life, perhaps, had softened the edge. It had not. She did not hesitate. The shot went through the gap in the observation post's support beams and covered 23 meters, which was not a distance that required calculation. It was a distance that required intention, and Thomas Crane, who had betrayed an entire unit for reasons that had seemed adequate to him, and had pursued the surviving loose end for 6 years, because that was the only way certain people slept soundly, dropped into the snow without a sound. Victoria Strand Clara Weston Phantom Snow lowered the rifle. She waited 60 seconds. She listened to the installation. She listened to the marsh. She listened to the specific quality of silence that follows resolution, different from the silence that precedes threat, distinct in a way that she had never been able to explain to anyone who hadn't heard both. It was over. She slung the rifle and walked back toward the perimeter wire. The snow was still falling. In the east, behind the white curtain of the storm, the darkness was beginning to differentiate into shades of gray. Dawn came slowly. It came the way dawn always came to the Halverson marshes in winter, not as a sunrise, because the cloud cover was too complete for a sunrise, but as a gradual lightening of the gray above the white until the world shifted from black and gray to white and gray, and you could see shapes again. Trees, tents, sandbags, tire ruts, the long, irregular lines where the snow had been disturbed in the night. The staff of Forward Medical Station Keller came out of their positions one by one. They were quiet in the way that people are quiet after something very large has moved through the space they occupy. Not shocked. Shock is an immediate response, and the immediate response had happened hours ago. This was the quiet that comes after. The quiet of revision, of existing mental models being replaced, piece by piece, with ones that accommodated the previous 8 hours. Dr. Harrison Bowles stood at the junction of the supply tent and Bay 3, his surgical coat open, his hands in his pockets, watching Clara Weston disinfect and dress the wound she had sustained on her right forearm at some point during the night. She had said nothing about it. She had treated it herself, sitting on a supply crate with the clinical attention of a nurse, which she was, applying the same care she would have applied to any patient and no more. How many? Bole asked. Neutralized or otherwise resolved, she said, without looking up from her work. 8 in total. Casualties on our side? Private Fuller has a contusion on his left shoulder from the wire breach. The patient in Bay 3 will need monitoring for the next 6 hours, but should be stable. Beyond that, she taped the final bandage edge no. Bole looked at her. He had been looking at her since she'd returned, trying to reconcile the woman who had been quietly managing patient charts for 5 days with what he had observed in the preceding 8 hours. The reconciliation was not coming easily. "Raymond Cord wants to talk to you," he said. "I know. He says he knows who you are. He thinks he knows." She stood up from the supply crate. "He knows a piece of it. Is he right?" She looked at Bull directly, which she did rarely. Her gray eyes were the same temperature they had always been the same temperature, he realized, as the air outside. "He's right about what matters," she said. Williams appeared in the tent entrance. He had the look of a man who had been on a radio for 4 hours and had just been told something that overrode all of his fatigue. "Extraction confirmed," he said. 45 minutes. They're sending a medical helicopter and a security element. He paused. They asked who called in the contact. "Staff," Clara said. "They asked specifically." Clara looked at him. "Staff." Williams looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Christopher Dell found her in the supply tent 15 minutes later, methodically returning equipment to its proper place. He watched her for a moment without speaking, which was, for Christopher Dell, unusual. "I looked up the Ghost Sniper unit," he said. "The Ghost Sniper unit doesn't officially exist," she said. "Right. But there are things, online, reports, from operational zones." He shifted his weight. "There's a name that keeps coming up, associated with specific operations, very high-value targets, long-range, Arctic conditions. The name is—" "I know the name," she said. "The record says she died." "Records are documents," Clara said. "Documents are created by people. People make errors." Dell was quiet for a moment. "Will you stay?" he asked. She stopped arranging equipment. She looked at the tent wall, which was canvas, which was unremarkable in every way. Beyond it, the marsh. Beyond that, the trees. Beyond those, everything else, the world of records and names and histories that had been calling for 6 years. "I don't stay," she said. "That's how it works." "How? What works?" She picked up the last piece of equipment and placed it in its proper location. "Being what I am." She said it without drama, without weight, as a simple statement of operational fact. Master Sergeant Raymond Cord found her at the perimeter wire 20 minutes before extraction, standing in the snow with no coat, looking north into the marsh. She heard him coming. His gait had the specific asymmetry of the thigh injury and did not turn. "Victoria," he said. She said nothing. "I won't report it," he said. "Whatever that's worth." He stopped beside her. He was a large man, and the space he occupied in the cold seemed solid, deliberate. 6 years is a long time to be dead. "Long enough," she said. "There'll be others. You know that." Not Crane specifically, but he paused people connected to what he was connected to. "I know. You could come back. Properly. There are people who would." The word was quiet and final and contained nothing he could argue against. He stood beside her for a moment. The snow fell around them both. In the distance, the extraction helicopter's approach was beginning to be audible, a low vibration that came before the sound itself. "Phantom snow," he said. She said nothing. "They said you couldn't be killed in open country in a blizzard," he said. "They said you were born in it, that you were part of it, that you'd be out there." He gestured at the marsh, the trees, the white somewhere, as long as winters lasted. She looked at him then. The expression on her face was not quite a smile. It was something smaller and more private than that. "They were right about some of it," she said. The helicopter was closer now. She could feel it in the air. She turned and walked back toward the installation. She walked through the perimeter wire. She walked past the derelict supply vehicle and the sandbag wall and the collapsed drainage pipes and all the positions she had occupied in the dark, and none of them looked like positions. Now they were just features of the terrain, ordinary, empty, in the gray morning light. She went to Bay 3 and checked on the chest wound patient, who was stable. She updated 3 patient charts with the morning vitals, writing in the same careful, legible hand she had always used. She returned the rifle to Raymond Cord without speaking. She packed her single bag efficient, practiced in 3 minutes flat. When the helicopter touched down on the cleared ground south of the installation, she was standing at the perimeter with her bag over one shoulder, and her face turned into the wind. Dr. Bull walked out to stand beside her. "You'll be gone before the paperwork arrives," he said. "Probably. I won't." He stopped. Reconsidered. "Clara Weston's assignment records will show she completed her rotation." She looked at him. "You kept 8 people alive last night," he said. "More, if you count the patients." He was not a sentimental man. He stated it as a clinical fact. "Whatever your name is." The helicopter crew was signaling. She picked up her bag. "Dr. Bowl," she said, "the burn patients in Bay 2 will need their dressings changed at noon. The solution concentration in the third shelf kit is wrong. Someone restocked it from the wrong batch. Use the kits in the second shelf instead." He looked at her. She walked toward the helicopter. She did not look back. The snow was still falling. It fell across the installation, across the depressions in the ground where 8 men had come and not returned, across the observation post leaning at 11 degrees toward the northwest, across the frozen cattails at the edge of the marsh. It covered everything in the same patient, indiscriminate white. By the time the helicopter lifted off and banked north, the footprints she had left in the snow were already filling in. By the time it cleared the tree line, you would have needed to know where to look to find any trace of her at all. And by the time the blizzard finally broke 4 hours later, with the specific abruptness of northern weather, the clouds simply parting and the light coming through like a decision, the marsh was clean and white and unmarked, and the installation's perimeter showed no evidence of anything unusual. And if you stood at the northern wire and looked out across the ice and the frozen cattails and the black spruce silence, you would see nothing. You would hear nothing. But somewhere in the particular quality of the cold, in the way the light moved in from the east and the shadows retreated, and the world reset itself for another day, something remained. Something that was not quite a presence and not quite an absence. Something that had no name in any language, designed for ordinary things. In the medical tents, the patients recovered. In the communications tent, Williams filed his report, which described an attack by unknown personnel, successfully repelled by station staff under difficult conditions. He used the plural. He credited no individual. He thought this was what she would have wanted. In Bay 3, Dr. Bowley changed the burn dressings at noon, using the kits from the second shelf. They were, he noted, exactly the correct concentration. He stood there for a moment, with the kit in his hand, in the clean winter light that was coming through the tent walls now that the storm had broken, and he thought about what Raymond Court had told him, about a unit that didn't officially exist, about a name that appeared in operational reports but never in any personnel file, about a woman who had been declared dead and had chosen, for 6 years, to stay that way, about the particular quality of competence that looks like nothing until it becomes necessary, and then becomes everything. He thought about this. Then he went back to work. Outside, the marsh lay still and white under the cleared sky. The trees stood at the edge of it, black and patient. The wind moved through the frozen cattails with the thin, high whistle of something that has no message and no intention, just movement, just cold, just the old arithmetic of open country in winter. And if there was a shadow at the tree line barely visible, barely there, a shift in the darkness that might have been anything at all, it was gone before you could look at it directly. That was always how it worked. That was always how she worked. If you see the shadow moving before you hear the shot, it is already too late.